In the meantime, he still had absolute control as Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, the only Prime Minister to dominate Cabinet in this way since his hero Dick Seddon a century earlier.
He was chairman of the board, he was the treasurer, he set the agenda. And it was almost impossible to defeat him. That's why we wanted him desperately to give up the Ministry of Finance.
So was that expressed at the time?
Very much so, yes.
So how did he react to that?
Well, he ignored it. That's true.
But Robert Muldoon was about to make a big mistake. When he indulged his cabinet crony Frank Gill by sending him to Washington, it meant a by-election in East Coast Bays.
We knew we were going to lose. We knew a week, 2 weeks before we were going to lose the seat.
Social Credit's Gary Knapp took it and almost cost Robert Muldoon his job.
Well, fairly obviously, the leadership in for this type of result.
Even though he called the by-election, of course others were to blame.
Rob, very unwisely, from somewhere overseas, India or somewhere, said, oh, well, it's all the party organisation's fault and it's all the candidates' fault. And at that stage there was uproar within the party, and that started the movement towards the revolt.
He was in India at the time. Despite his personal coolness, Muldoon enjoyed the public limelight, and as Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, there were always opportunities on the international stage. He travelled frequently, and his travels during the East Coast Bays fiasco allowed serious trouble to brew back home.
The majority of members of Parliament had signed a list saying that they would be prepared to change from Rob Muldoon to Brian Talboys.
The Quigley philosophy is particularly in tune with that of Party Chairman George Chapman and many backbench members.
Minister of Works Derek Quigley was spiritual leader of the so-called colonels who plotted Muldoon's end. He'd already clashed with Muldoon over his controlled economy.
We were trying to bring the Prime Minister back into line according to National Party philosophy, which he'd deviated from massively.
If the caucus wants to make a change and wants me to be part of that change, then I am willing to serve.
The colonels had the numbers, but they didn't have a leader. Brian Talboys was diffident. And then the tearaway from Tamaki got back and got heavy.
That's another one that I thought was against me. These boys coming round. No, these boys are getting the message all around the country.
One by one, Muldoon leaned on the rebels as heavily as only he could, and one by one they folded.
Funny message.
One I can remember collapsed in the house with the pressure. Another one went away for a weekend to have a quiet time. So the pressure was absolutely intense, but it would be on a one-for-one basis.
Muldoon won because he cowed the rebels who had no real leader, and because he went public and made a direct appeal to Rob's mob.
Because I don't think that it should be done behind closed doors in the present situation where I've been overseas for a long time and people have been organising things in my absence.
He knew what was going on. And at the end of the day, I think he knew that he was going to survive, so he could be a bit rough with a few people.
Those who were strongly in favour of change, once the withering eye was on them, in many instances very quickly ran for cover and or went up to the Prime Minister to say, well, Prime Minister, really and truly, I'm very much on your side and I think you're a great bloke.
The coup was crushed. Derek Quigley would resign from Cabinet in '82 and then leave politics 2 years later. Robert Muldoon was still in control and heading for his next great test, the '81 election. The Springbok tour would be used to win the provincial marginals. Think Big projects would be used to restore confidence in an economy which no amount of Muldoon tinkering seemed to put right. But Robert Muldoon was out of his age.
He was a product of the Second World War. He was a dynamic political leader through the 60s in his own field and as leader through the 70s, but by the end of the 70s, you know, times had moved on.
He was also running out of friends. The man who once boasted that he needed fewer friends and more enemies was getting his way.
Every night on television, it would be led off with Muldoon more often than not, or some of his colleagues, and they were ramming somebody. They were into doctors, they were into farmers, they were into industrialists, into unionists, newspaper men. There was always somebody every night. And there was a great bitterness in New Zealand life then, and it was a very ugly thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister and Mrs. Muldoon.
81 election, the ranks of Muldoon's political friends were shrinking too.
Increasingly, he relied on the old caucus friendships of his early days.
Simply because they'd done political spade work for him in the caucus. As a result, he surrounded himself at the closest hand with ministers who were by no means as competent as some that he could have chosen. In fact, by and large, they were incompetent.
Muldoon had always used relationships as a way of keeping control, and by demanding absolute loyalty.
He would go for the jugular. He might have to remind someone that if they wanted a lesson in loyalty, he would give them a lesson in loyalty, and they knew nothing about loyalty since the day they were born, sort of thing. He was very good at, humiliating members of the caucus.
But Muldoon also built a network of control throughout New Zealand by giving people jobs they wanted.
He made a lot of people very vulnerable because he used patronage in a most extraordinary manner. So I would never accept anything that Muldoon offered in any shape or form. I just didn't want to know.
By the 1981 election, a lot of people didn't want to know. But Robert Muldoon's machinery for control was so complete, he would still hold the power to which he was now heavily addicted.